Good evening, everyone. I'm Steve Millies, the director of the Bernardin Center and a member of the faculty at Catholic Theological Union here in Chicago. It's my happy duty to offer you a welcome here tonight because CTU's senior leadership right now, down the hall from where I am, is meeting with a visiting team from the Association of Theological Schools as a part of our decennial reaccreditation. For those of you who know something about higher education, you'll know what an important moment this is for any institution. This is a reaffirmation of our authority to grant degrees, and only something so important could keep our president, Sister Barbara Reed, or Roger Schrader, our vice president and academic dean, from being here with us tonight. Yet I do bring you their warm welcome and their regrets here as we begin this fall semester's Shapiro Lecture. The Catholic Jewish Studies program has been a part of CTU since its beginning in 1968. Interreligious dialogue is an ineliminable part of CTU's identity, but perhaps no dialogue is more important for Catholics to engage in than the one that asks us to examine our relationship to the children of Abraham's covenant, whose scripture we share, yet with whom our Christian community has had such a fraught relationship for so many centuries. The long history of anti-Semitism impels us to a dialogue that over time has become as much joyous as a recognition of a moral duty. In friendship, we continue this conversation in a spirit of encounter and accompaniment, walking the road together, an image that Pope Francis likes to use. Friends along the way, we listen to each other, we help each other, we become companions, each on her or his own journey, but better for the sharing and for knowing one another. In that way, I welcome you, even if virtually for now, to CTU. In a special way, I welcome our distinguished speaker tonight. But to introduce him, let me turn to my friend and companion here on the CTU faculty, Dr. Malka Zeiger-Simkovich, the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of CTU's Catholic Jewish Studies program. Malka.
Thank you, Steve, and good evening. I am delighted to welcome you all to this year's Fall Shapiro Lecture, our inaugural event of the year. Our 3 annual Shapiro Lectures offer incredible opportunities to learn from renowned Jewish studies scholars. While these lectures are typically delivered in person, and we wish that we were gathered together in one room tonight, we also deeply appreciate the opportunity to welcome all of you, especially those of you tuning in from beyond the Chicagoland community. I'm thrilled but not surprised to see that we have friends in attendance tonight from all over the world to hear our featured speaker, Dr. Mark Brettler. Dr. Brettler is the Bernice and Morton Lerner Distinguished Professor of Judaic Studies in the Department of Religious Studies at Duke University. His books include The Creation of History in Ancient Israel, How to Read the Jewish Bible, The Jewish Study Bible, edited with Adele Berlin, and The Bible and the Believer with Peter Enns and Daniel Harrington. He also co-edited the outstanding Jewish Annotated New Testament. I recommend that to every single one of my students every semester with Amy Jill Levine, and co-authored The Bible with and Without Jesus, How Jews and Christians Read the Same Stories Differently, also with Amy Jill Levine, which was recently hailed by Reverend Dr. Michael Trainer as a scholarly gift that will enhance Jewish Christian dialogue and biblical interpretation by Jews and Christians. Dr. Brettler is committed to making the Jewish community more aware of the richness of early Jewish literature, which includes the New Testament, and to introducing academic biblical study to the broader global community. Since today is Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day, I also want to acknowledge the pain that Indigenous people in the Americas have suffered. The experiences of these communities underscore the need for dialogue and reconciliation, a need which remains urgent today. It is rather incredible to me that today also happens to be the feast of Pope John the 23rd, the very Pope who initiated the Second Vatican Council, which would produce the document known as Nostra Aetate that retracted the accusation of deicide leveled by the church against the Jews for almost 2,000 years. The Second Vatican Council began on this day, exactly 59 years ago, on October 11th, 1962. While a Pope's Feast Day and Indigenous Peoples Day don't share an immediately obvious relationship, the commemoration of both days can inspire us to consider all the ways that we can make small changes in our own lives to increase understanding and trust with others, even if we can't right the wrongs of the past. We will leave aside time for questions at the end, but feel free to post questions in the chat box anytime throughout the lecture, or you can send them directly to me or one of my colleagues at the Bernardine Center. I will then direct some of these questions to Dr. Brettler at the end of the lecture. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Mark Brettler.
Thank you all. What beats one wonderful introduction to wonderful introductions? So thank you very much for being so gracious. And in the same way that the introductions were offered in friendship, I hope to respond in friendship as well. As Professor Simkovich just noted, we really are celebrating 2 different days today, and actually 3 different days. And just give me a moment to get my PowerPoint working properly. There we go. And you'll see, yes, do we need to think about these days as days which are mutually exclusive from each other, or days which somehow can intersect? And that is really going to be the theme of my talk. Do we need to speak about and, or do we need to speak about or? So I think it's very fortuitous that this is a day which is Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day, and celebrates the incredible accomplishments of Pope John the 23rd, and indeed is the anniversary of the Second Vatican Council. And you might think that we need to choose one of these over the other, but my whole theme for today is that we do not need to be thinking about thinking about or, but we really must think about and. And the most distressing thing that happened in the process of publishing this book, which I co-authored with Amy Jill Levine, was when once the proofs for the book came back, and instead of their saying the Bible with and without Jesus, they said the Bible with or without Jesus. And we both screamed, we tore out our hair, we contacted the publisher immediately. And of course, it was simply a person involved in the production of the book who did not understand the important and not so subtle points that we were trying to make. Namely, the way in which this issue is studied is typically people will talk about either the Bible with Jesus or the Bible without Jesus, and never the twain will meet. The same way that you have in certain states in America. I read CNN news this morning. Some states will have either Indigenous Peoples Day or they will have Thanksgiving Day. It did not mention any state that was going to have, instead of both of those, Pope St. John the 23rd Day, but that might have been a wonderful compromise. It is not the or that we need to think about, but the and that we need to think about. Let me start a little by talking about the genesis of this book, because had you told me 20 years ago that I was going to write this book, I would have said that you are totally crazy. And to the extent that I engage with the New Testament in a significant or serious fashion, I really am an accidental New Testament scholar. Well, my engagement really began in the year 2011, but really what happened before the year 2011. I've been doing editorial works for Bibles in Oxford University Press for close to 20 years, and it started in the following way. The executive editor called me, and a wonderful man, Episcopalian, you'll understand why that is important. And he said, we've never had anybody involved in the New Oxford Annotated Bible. And as he said, as I've been reading through it, there's certain things that disturb me about the annotations. For example, the fact that some of the annotations in the Old Testament talk about the God of law and contrast that God of law and wrath with the God of love in the New Testament. And therefore, we would like you to be one of the first Jewish sub-editors of the New Oxford Annotated Bible. I said, sure. If any of you have the opportunity, the Bible is a wonderful book to get royalties on. So I enjoyed that very, very much. And actually, we're about to put out a new edition of that. And a few years later, he said, well, we have produced a Catholic study Bible, and we think it's about time that we produce a Jewish study Bible. And he asked me to co-edit that, which I did very happily with a wonderful scholar, Adele Berlin from University of Maryland. And I enjoyed it so much that I said to him, quite honestly, half joking, and I'm still not sure if I'm serious or not, I enjoyed co-editing the Jewish Study Bible so much, and maybe let's do a follow-up project. How about a Jewish annotated New Testament? So he sort of chuckled, and 3 years later said, you know what? I discussed it with the people in Oxford English. In Oxford, England, where ago, you can co-edit it with Amy Jill Levine. So that is the genesis of the first edition of the Jewish Annotated New Testament, which got a fair amount of press. It was really seen as a curio, because usually the words Jewish New Testament do not go together, although they certainly should go together. And as a result of a certain amount of interest, only 6 years later did Amy Jill Levine and I produce a much larger edition. And truly, one of the thrills of my life was 2 years ago in the first row of St. Peter's Square, having the opportunity to present that particular book along with Amy Jill Levine to the Pope. So that got me into the New Testament. That explains how I became, in this very indirect way, an accidental New Testament scholar. And Amy Jill Levine and I enjoyed working so much together that we decided that rather than in addition to editing a book together, given all the themes that we saw that really need to be discussed in a broader sense, we would write a book together, which explains this book, the Bible with and without Jesus, how Jews and Christians read the same stories differently. The cover requires some explanation. It is from a Marc Chagall, and who of course is a Jewish artist. But if you look at it, you know, Jewish art does not typically depict its angels with halos, most visible here, perhaps slightly visible in the others as well. And in a sense, choosing this particular Chagall, especially considering what it was based on, was a very, very intentional decision, which in some ways is representative of the book as a whole. Oh, I'm finally speaking in Chicago. I guess the word "in" belongs in quotation marks here. And I can still remember, I was only in my 20s, the first time I saw the white crucifixion in the Art Institute. I don't think that my initial words when I saw that painting for the first time should be repeated in public. But here you have Chagall, the Jewish painter. You know, this is really the beginning of the period of persecution of the Jews by the Nazis, but before the beginning of the a year before the beginning of the Second World War. And here you have Jesus, clearly the Jew, wearing a talit, a Jewish prayer shawl, in a rather unusual way, crucified with the beginning of the images of the destruction of European Jewry. So that's why Chagall worked super well. And Chagall, in his particular painting of Abraham and the Three Angels from 1966, is imitating directly one of the most famous icons of the Eastern Church by Andrei Rublev, which goes by two quite interesting different titles, depending on who is giving it the title, namely the Hospitality of Abraham or the Trinity. Because after all, Abraham had three angels who were visiting him. And in Christian tradition, and here are the lovely halos that all three of them have, in Christian tradition, this is understood to be a visit by the Trinity. So there really is quite a bit going on in the choice that we made of this particular book cover and the way in which it mixes in a confusing way, which I very much hope to unconfuse for you, Jewish and Christian imagery. The subtitle of the book really deals with how Jews and Christians read the same stories differently. And those are stories from, and here I have to stop because I'm not quite sure what word I want to use. Do I want to use the word Old Testament? Do I want to use the word Tanakh or Hebrew Bible or one of the other newer terms? And here I just want to start by correcting a very important misapprehension, which really helps divide Jews and Christians, because many Jews and Christians think, oh yeah, this is merely a matter of terminology, and that the Jews and the Christians call the same book by different names. This is not the same book. And it is different in a wide variety of ways. And even more, I'm delighted I'm speaking at a Catholic venue because the ways in which they differ are even greater. So let us remember that the Jewish Hebrew Bible or Tanakh has 3 sections and ends typically with the Book of Chronicles. I'll come to that right at the end. The Christian Old Testament has 4 sections, ends with the prophetic section, which functions as a wonderful segue into the New Testament from a Christian perspective, but that doesn't quite work from a Jewish perspective. By the way, I'll put in parentheses, that Christian order, sometimes called an Alexandrian order, was probably originally a Jewish order, which was adopted by the early Christ believing community. I'm trying to be really careful here. These folks did not yet self-identify as Christians, probably, at the point in which this happened. So there's a difference in sectioning. There's a difference in order. There also are differences in particular books, especially if you're a Catholic. So for example, books such as The Wisdom of Ben Sirach or Sirach, or some of the books of the Maccabees, and certain other books are present in the Catholic Old Testament, albeit as deuterocanonical, books which Protestants would call apocrypha. They are nowhere to be found in the Jewish Bible, even though those are all originally Jewish books. And in some cases, and this should not be trivialized, the form of individual books is different. My favorite case for this is the Book of Esther, where I'm imagining a Catholic who knows the Catholic Book of Esther well, which reflects the Greek Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Bible, that might know the book via that particular translation, and a Jew are having a wonderful water cooler conversation sometime, I guess, in April, before the festival of Purim, to which I will return later. And the Jew says to the Catholic, "What a weird book we read in synagogue last night. Did you know that it is the only book or the only one of 2 books that never mentions the name of God?" To which the Catholic will respond, I read that book last week and I saw God in it quite a few times. And I even seem to remember Esther praying to God. And the Jew says, "What are you talking about?" And the Catholic says, "What are you talking about?" And then they realize that they are reading 2 different editions of the very same book. So it is really important to remember that when we talk about Jews and Catholics, or even Jews and Protestants, or Jews and Eastern Christians interpreting the same book, it really is not the same book at all. And this is often reflected in passages from the New Testament, which quote, and here I'm talking in a Christian context, so I'll quite intentionally use the word Old Testament, that quote the Old Testament, but all the gospel writers knew Greek, and it is questionable how much, if any, Hebrew they actually knew. So the way in which the earliest Christians were reading the Old Testament was through the Septuagint, this ancient Greek translation, and this makes a very big difference. So let me talk about one of the cases where it makes the biggest difference, namely Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. I've highlighted the two words in yellow, which are most significant. I'll just read it in Hebrew. It's always a good idea for everybody to hear a little Hebrew. Lachein yitain Adonai hu lechem ot. So we're good so far. God is going to give some sort of sign. Next word, hine, talks about something new that's happening. But hine ha'alma hara v'yoledet ben, v'karat shmo Immanuel. So here, this is a translation from the New Jewish Publication Society. Assuredly, my Lord will give you a sign of his own accord. Look, the young woman, Alma, is the Hebrew. This word here is with child and about to give birth to a son. Let her name him Emmanuel. Please note, the Hebrew term that is used is the word Alma, which simply means a woman of marriageable age. A word which is used in Hebrew for a virgin is a different word, Betula. And the verb tense here, most likely in Hebrew, refers to something that is about to happen in the near future. But the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation, either for translation reasons or perhaps having a slightly different text, because indeed one of the Dead Sea Scrolls is slightly different here, though not the same as the Septuagint, renders this. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the virgin, Greek Parthenos, the word Parthenon comes from that, temple that is dedicated to the goddess, shall be with child sometime in the future, as opposed to is with child, and will bear a son, and you shall name him. Please note the difference between you shall name him and let her name him. Okay, at least we have the same name. We have the name Emmanuel, although I will point out that in Greek, it's written as a single word. In Hebrew, it is written as two different words. Well, so what is the text of Isaiah chapter 7:14? There is a difference in the two communities about what that text is. And when it is used in Matthew, which I always call the most Jewish of the Gospels, I feel a real affinity toward Matthew. And generally, New Testament scholars understand it as the most Jewish of the Gospels, has many strong connections to what you later find in rabbinic literature, where Matthew is structured around a large number of fulfillment narratives, where sections from the Old Testament are quoted, and this is done as verse 22 to fulfill a particular verse from the Old Testament. So here from the first chapter of Matthew, dealing with the soon-to-be birth of Jesus, where Mary is pregnant while Mary and Joseph are merely engaged and are not yet married, has not yet consummated the marriage, and he wants to, note please, not have her stoned for adultery, but quietly divorced at this point. And then he's told, no need to divorce, as verse 20 says, because this child has been conceived from the Holy Spirit, she shall or will bear a son. Now, a little interesting here. He is not named Emmanuel, but he is named Jesus. This is a pun on words, which only works in Hebrew. Jesus is Yeshua, Yehoshua, the same as Joshua, which comes from the Hebrew root Yasha, but it is not a military victory, but rather for he will save his people from their sins. And then the typical fulfillment formula, all this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. They shall name him Emmanuel. That's where the quote ends. And because the author of Matthew understands that his audience has no clue of what's going on in the Hebrew, he glosses the end of the verse for them, which means God is with us, which, by the way, also makes a whole lot of sense as a meaning in this particular context. So the first point I'd like to make, even when Jews and Christians are reading the same verse, there is an and going on there. We are often reading the same verse in different ways, perhaps through the Hebrew verses through the Greek. And to bring to my next point, we're often reading the verse with different punctuation. Now, this is my favorite t-shirt. I was told it would be inappropriate to undress and to show you that I am wearing the t-shirt for this particular audience, but I do own it. And it shows the difference that a comma makes. Yeah, commas save grannies. Let's eat grandma versus let's eat, comma, grandma. The Hebrew text in its original form, in its early form, and we see this, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, did not have punctuation. So that if I'm going to read Isaiah chapter 40, verse 3, I'm going to force myself to read it in a monotone way without punctuation, just stopping after each word. Kol, Koreh, Bamidbar, Anu, Derech, Adonai, Yasheru, Ba'arava, Mesilah, Le'Eloheinu. Now, even if you don't know any Hebrew, you would recognize that if I am reading, I guess these are 10 words, I do need punctuation somewhere. That's natural in patterns of speech. But where do I punctuate? So here's the issue. A voice calls out in the wilderness, clear the path of the Lord. I really only need to deal with the first half of the verse. So the big question is, where does this Hebrew word, bamidbar, belong? Does it belong with the first part of the sentence, for where the voice rings out? Or does it belong with the second part of the sentence, for where you need to clear in the desert a road for the Lord? You could see the difference here, where I've moved in the desert, the place of in the desert. Here it is after the colon and after the opening quotation marks. While here it is before the colon and before the opening quotation marks. Which one should it be? Well, if you know your synoptic gospels well, you are surely going to know that this is stated in reference to John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer might be a better translation. And certainly the New Testament translation is that it is a road which needs to be cleared in the desert, rather than the desert being the location from which the voice rings out. This is, this second one is a Jewish reading of the text. This first one is a Christian reading of the text. So punctuation not only translation, but something as simple as punctuation can divide between different communities. And we also must remember that even though both communities often use the same terms, we use the same terms in very different ways. Bible means something different, which my students get really confused. So actually on Facebook, there was a post from somebody who teaches at a different Catholic university who was saying that he just couldn't convince his students that the book of Luke is not in the Old Testament. Okay, well, the book of Luke is neither in the Old Testament nor in the Hebrew Bible. When I say Bible, I'm going to mean something very different than when a Catholic or a Protestant or an Eastern Christian is going to use the word Bible. Those are going to be very different corpora of books. Same thing for Messiah. Same word. Is it Messiah past and future, or only the Messiah in the future? Sorry, couldn't resist in this picture. When I say priest, I might mean this. When others listening say priest, they might very well be this. When I say Sabbath, I mean Saturday. When others say Sabbath, they might very well mean the Lord's Day on Sunday. So we can use the same words, as I say in the title, that words can join our community, but also, given the different interpretations of those words, they can divide communities as well. Another significant division that I'm going to come to in more detail later, but begin to explain now, is that even though in all Bibles I know, every verse is printed in the same font size, different religious communities give different verses greater or lesser meanings. So whether you are Christian or Jewish, the following two promises, and I give you just a sample text where they appear, but there are many texts where these promises appear. Whether you're Jewish or Christian, the promise of the land to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is going to appear in your Bible. Indeed, the first place where it appears is in Genesis 12:7, which indeed will be the Torah reading, will be the lectionary reading this coming Shabbat within Judaism. So that's there. And it's there for the Christian community as well. And equally there, and in all Bibles I know, printed in exactly the same size, is the promise of an everlasting dynasty to David, where Samuel says to David, your house, David is the referent there, and your kingship shall ever be secure before you. Your throne shall be established forever. And these two promises certainly have certain levels of importance in both of these religions, but this first promise, I would argue, has much more significance within Judaism, where the issue of land and possession of land is very significant, an issue which is not as significant within Christianity, where this everlasting promise of a dynasty to David, which certainly is connected to the notion that Jesus is of Davidic descent, is much more significant. So we share the same Bible, but effectively, I would say within Christianity, this text from Genesis might be printed effectively, this is a metaphor, in 10 or 12 point font, while this text concerning an everlasting dynasty to David is in 24 or 36 point font. Same text, one of them is much more significant than the other, depending on the religion that you're talking about. And once you understand that, you're not going to solve the whole Middle East problem, but you're going to understand the Middle East problem much better. And one of the ways in which you see this difference is the way in which Jeremiah chapter 31, which is a really big text within Christianity and a much smaller text within Judaism. Because if you look at Jeremiah 31:31, which I am not going to discuss, that is where the term Brit Chadashah, New Covenant, which ultimately becomes New Testament, comes from. I'll just remind you that that is a later term applied to the New Testament. The New Testament had no consciousness of itself as a book. So only later people will actually be able to give it a name. But the name was chosen on the basis of some New Testament texts, especially from Paul, from Jeremiah 31:31. So that's the big chapter. And this passage, again, from the beginning of Matthew, concerning the massacre or murder of the innocents, says, then was fulfilled what had been spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, wailing in loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be consoled because they are no more. And that is where the quote from Jeremiah ends in the book of Matthew, because that is the part that is significant for the Christian interpretation of Jeremiah. But look at the next two verses in the book of Jeremiah itself, which are omitted by the author of Matthew. Thus said the Lord, speaking to, going back, speaking to Rachel, who is weeping. Restrain your voice from weeping, your eyes from shedding tears, for there is a reward for your labor, declares the Lord. They shall return from the enemy's land, and there is hope for your future, declares the Lord. Your children shall return to their country. Note how country, the centrality of the land of Israel, is important in Jeremiah. Those verses are omitted in the quotation or the citation of this verse in Matthew, reflecting already less of an interest in land and centrality of land in the early Christ-believing movement vis-a-vis other Jews. Same book, different verses emphasized, different verses quoted. And as such, texts and ideas are interpreted differently in each of those religions. And each of these is discussed in one chapter or another of the book, the Bible, with and without Jesus. So a significant problem that you have in Genesis chapter 1:26. Unlike all the other verses at the beginning of the chapter, where God seems to be speaking to himself, here suddenly there is a change. Vayomer Elohim, na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. And this is a correct translation. Let us make God, humankind, this is clearly a plural, in our image and in our likeness. I'm sorry, I should have continued with the rest of the verse. Who is this our? Unspecified. Christian tradition, this is understood quite early through Trinitarianism. In Jewish tradition, that simply is not an option. This is sometimes understood as a royal we, or understood as God taking counsel with other divine figures whom we might call angels. Or who is the referent in Isaiah 53:5 of this he? Now, before I get to reading the verse itself, let me just say something about this material from the end of 52 and the beginning of 53. Again, a significant difference, which is going to sound rather trivial, but I don't think is, between Jewish and Christian Bibles in English. Most Christian Bibles, I'd actually like to do a survey of this one day, like to insert little section or chapter headings telling you what is following and what it is about. So I'm going to bet that if you look at either the beginning of Isaiah 53 or the end of Isaiah 52, in most contemporary English Bibles that are written by Christians, you are going to see the term, the suffering servant. And you're going to think that that is part of the biblical text. That is not part of the biblical text. And we just even note that the term itself, suffering servant, as a technical term, is less than 200 years old. So I'm not going to ask in a technical sense, who is this suffering servant? But instead, I'm going to ask, who is this he who is wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities, and whose chastisement makes all of us whole and heals all of us? Same words, totally different reference to those words in the Jewish and Christian tradition. In Judaism, excuse me for saying it this way, it is anybody but Jesus. In Christian tradition, it is very much Jesus. And it is clear already from the earliest New Testament literature that either Jesus understood himself in this manner or the earliest followers of Jesus understood him in reference to this and related passages. So same passages, same words. I don't know if this is simpler or more complicated than moving a comma, but the issue of who is the pronoun referring to, who is the he, distinguish the two communities in a significant way. The Bible is a very laconic book. In contrast to Greek literature, it does not fill in lots of details. And in some ways, that encourages us to fill in details. So that if you ask a very simple question like, why and when is Abraham chosen? You're going to get two different answers in these different religious communities. The typical Jewish answer, which you can see over here in this lovely children's book illustration, from what I call Genesis 11.5, and I'll explain that in a moment, is Abram recognized God all by himself, and he tried to prove it to others. And one of the ways in which he did it was he destroyed his father Terach's idol shop, destroying all of the idols except for the largest. And he put a club in the largest idol. And when his father came back and said, what happened to the idol shop that I told you to watch for a couple of minutes? Abram said, well, the largest idol got really mad at the smaller idols and destroyed them all. And Terach, Abram's father, said, that's impossible. And Abram said, oh, now you're the one who said that, thereby proving Abram's righteousness and so forth. Now, that is a story which is not in the Bible. I call it Genesis 11.5 because I have seen countless Jews looking for that story between Genesis 11 and Genesis chapter 12. It isn't there. It's part of the tradition, explaining the obvious question of why Abraham is chosen. The New Testament has a different tradition, reflected especially in Paul's epistle to the Romans chapter 4, which does not understand Abram is chosen in Genesis immediately before Genesis chapter 12, but rather connects it to the covenant between the pieces in Genesis chapter 15, where it says of Abram, he believed in the Lord, and the Lord reckoned it to him as righteousness, using two key words that would be so important to the early Christ-believing community. Believed, if that's really the right translation of the Hebrew, or trusted better, and righteousness. So ask the same question, which is the answer of which is present in neither the Jewish or the Christian Hebrew Bible Old Testament. The different religious communities are going to give you very different answers. And to have one final example before my not so long extended example about differences in these communities. So let me start with a notion that has become central, especially since the time of the very important early church father Augustine, original sin. And let me ask, this is a bit of a trick question, is original sin found in the Bible or not? And let me just say, the closest original sin is found in the Bible is in the letter to the Romans, where it's perhaps can be interpreted in relation to original sin. Just as one man's trespass led to condemnation of all, so one man's act of righteousness leads to justification and life for all. These types of what are called the negative typologies, with Jesus as their focus, very much typify Paul and very much typify Romans. In other words, according to this, as a result of what Adam did, people lost it all. And as a result of the arrival of Jesus, people are going to gain it all. And one way of understanding this is that through the original sin, it's actually quite interesting here that here it is Adam and not Eve who is blamed, but through the original sin, all is lost. And in one form or another, for the last almost 2 millennium, this is our 1.5 plus, this has become a central Christian doctrine. I'd like to point out that this idea never appears in the Hebrew Bible in the book of Genesis. In other words, there's no notion there, anything that it says in chapter 3 of Genesis, which is where this is narrated, that what Adam did is going to redound upon all further generations as a sin, which inheres in them. But, and this is going to be a very strange but, and is going to surprise the Jewish viewers of this. There is a notion of original sin which is found in the Bible, and it is found in Psalm 51, which actually is also a very important psalm within Christianity. But Jews don't even know of this. It plays no significant role in Jewish liturgy. Hen be'avon cholalti, uvechet yechematni imi. Indeed, I was born guilty, a sinner when my mother conceived me. So now I'm going to say something really strange, and I'm not misspeaking. The only place where original sin is really found in the Bible, writ large, the Christian Bible, is in the Jewish part of the Bible, in Psalm 51, but where it does not appear in relation to Adam. So in a sense, this is an idea which clearly was circulating in Judaism and was taken by these early Christ believers and was applied specifically to Jesus. I would like to bring some of this together. This is an entire chapter of the book, and obviously I'm not going to represent an entire chapter here, by talking about different Jewish and Christian interpretations of Psalm 22, which opens, my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay, you're all going to recognize that this is, excuse the way I phrase it, a super duper important psalm for within Christianity, reflected especially in Mark, but in Mark's parallels, as in the Passion of Jesus, where Jesus is about to die, where you have something which is really quite unusual in a bunch of ways in this verse from Mark. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. Wow, this is being quoted in Hebrew, the first 3 words, and in Aramaic, right? It's getting mixed together, transliterated into a Greek text. And here you have exactly what we saw earlier with Emmanuel. There's an assumption that the listeners or readers don't know Greek. So therefore, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Which is a direct quote from Psalm 22, which, and I'm going to say this carefully, and I honestly believe this, in its original context, is a rather typical lament of the individual or petition of the individual, one of the main genres of Hebrew songs. So by this I mean, Psalm 22 in the Hebrew text is not marked as being anything special, and is probably the sort of psalm that is, if an individual went to the temple and he or she said, listen, I'm having real trouble. Help me, oh Levites, give me a psalm to recite. This is the sort of psalm that such an individual might have been given. And what I'm going to do now is reflect something that we do in each of our major chapters, where we talk about what the psalm originally meant, where each of our main chapters has three things: what the psalm originally meant and, not or, what the psalm meant in Christian tradition, and, not or, what the psalm meant in Jewish tradition. And the words that I have highlighted here, which you might recognize, are words that are going to be cited or alluded to in the New Testament in reference to the Passion, both in the Gospels and in other literature. So how's a lament structured? Well, first, the individual talks about a problem. Actually, first, there's a type of invocation of the deity, my God, Eli, Eli. Then the problem. Okay, the problem is divine abandonment. Now, how do you convince God to come back to you? You praise God. We trusted you in the past. And you make yourself look small before God. How do you do this? I actually love this verse, although this does not appear in the Passion narrative. I'm a worm. Okay, you can't be much lower than that. And you imagine a situation, I emphasize that, which would reflect what a bad state you're in, how others mock you, as you can see here. Others mock me, and so forth. And you want to make God feel sorry for you. Okay, dried up like a broken piece of pottery. I can't even talk. I'm like dust. My tongue sticks to my jaws. I'm surrounded by dogs. Hands and feet are either shriveled or pierced. No time to go into that, but that's awfully significant. The Hebrew isn't clear there. And then this rather odd image, the people think I'm about to die. They've already cast lots for my clothes. Okay, you get his shorts, you get his pants. Sorry, it's hot here today. You get his shoes and so forth. Then you call to God and you offer a motivation for God that you save me. I'm going to declare your greatness among everyone. All of these verses in yellow are reflected in one way or another in the New Testament, where Psalm 22, where the Psalm 22, if I were to print a Hebrew Bible for Christians, I would print Psalm 22 with 40-point font. This is a psalm, O Christians, that you have to read to understand your own religion. So in not only this reference to the psalm is not only in its introduction, but the psalm, parts of it are quoted throughout. I'll only do some small sections of it. Even in the non-synoptic Gospel of John, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts. That is a direct reference to what we saw in Psalm 22, or, what you have, the way in which Jesus is mocked. Oh, this is directly reflected in Matthew, the way Jesus is mocked while he is on the cross. Jesus' mouth is dried up. He is thirsty. That is probably a reflection of the psalm as well. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd. And indeed, there are probably well over 10 allusions. That's a lot. It's not a super long psalm. It's not Psalm 119. Well over 10 allusions to Psalm 22 in the New Testament as a whole, where the early followers of Jesus use the psalm to organize various aspects of the crucifixion, though it is certainly possible that Jesus recited the first verse of the psalm, and there may have even been some confusion, or Jesus might have called for Elijah, Eliah or Eliyahu, which sounds just like Eli, my God. And there was confusion among the people who were there, and they thought, no, Jesus is not crying for Elijah, but Jesus is saying, Eli, Eli, and these folks knew their Bible well. These chapters did not yet have numbers, but they said, oh yeah, Jesus is reciting Psalm 22, and therefore that needs to be a central psalm for us. Now in Judaism, this is not a central psalm. As I say here, I hope you're not reading this on the telephone. It's a rather an important text. It's in 10-point font. Same text, not important. It is connected to Purim, the Jewish sort of carnivalesque festival, and some think that it's connected to Purim as a way of mocking Jesus, as a reaction against Christianity. This is reflected already in the Greek translation of Esther, which, as I noted earlier, is longer than the Hebrew text, which seems to allude to Psalm 22. But the earliest, clearest references are in Christian sources, where Justin, often called Justin Martyr, indicated that Trypho, who might or might not be connected to Rabbi Tarfon, refuses to see Jesus in the psalm. Okay, so clearly there's something competition going on here. And a few years later, Jerome said that this psalm cannot be understood in reference to Mordecai and Esther, the main protagonists of the Esther scroll. And you're only going to say something like that if people, namely the Jewish community, are understanding it that way. And indeed, even though this is a later tradition, the Babylonian Talmud does understand Psalm 22 this way. This is dealing with a portion of the scroll of Esther, where Esther is afraid to come before the king and is encouraged by Mordecai to do so. Again, if the king does not extend his staff, she is going to be executed. So the Babylonian Talmud says, the verse states with regard to Esther when she is on her way to see the king, and she stood in the inner court of the king's house. Rabbi Levi said, once she reached the chamber of idols, again, they're assuming that the inner chamber of the house was full of idols, the divine presence left her. The divine presence, which was giving her strength and allowing her to confront the king properly. So what did she recite? My God, why have you forsaken me? And as that text continues, the divine presence came back to her. I'm actually gonna, yeah. So my emphasis throughout the book has been that as Jews and Christians talking to each other, we are actually, thankfully, because of events that started in Vatican II, which actually also had a strong influence on the Protestant community as well. We need to be in a both and way of understanding. We need not to say our way is the only way of understanding our shared scripture. We need to sympathetically understand that our neighbors might be, our neighbors understand scripture differently, and there is validity to that particular understanding of scripture. And that is what we try to do in this book, in the different chapters of the book, which look at different Old Testament passages that are so significant for Christianity. But we try to help our readers understand there are at least 3 very different types of readings with ands between them, namely what the text originally meant, what it means in Judaism, and what it means in Christianity. And thus, and I never thought I would say this about any book that I wrote, the most important word in the book's title is the word and.